And the microphone is on its way back.
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay. You need to say something?
Hershey Dwoskin is back virtually within the headlines at 2 o'clock, our usual season, but on Zoom. You don't need to register, just log on. And on the 17th of February, we have our first ever Books and Bites with Danielle Bélanger. It's on Monday, 10:30. It's a book review, and there will be food, and the author will be here, but you must register online. That's it. Without further ado, here's Dr. Joe Schwarcz with Science Demystified.
Okay, thank you. Are we ready to boycott all American products? Yes. Okay. All right, let's get down to business here. We're going to talk about food. And as you know, there are all kinds of things that we need to have in our diet in order to stay healthy. We have the so-called macronutrients, which are the carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins. Then, of course, the micronutrients, micro meaning that we need much less of them, the vitamins and minerals. And today, we're going to concentrate on the minerals, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what these are and how much of them we should have in our diet. There are a lot of minerals that the human body needs. And I think you'll recognize some of these. You'll recognize calcium and sodium and iron. But there are others, like chromium, silicon, that we need very little of. But generally, there's no problem because they are found in many, many foods. Now, what is the distinction between vitamins and minerals? It's actually quite straightforward, chemically speaking. Vitamins are substances that we must have in the diet because we cannot make them. The body cannot make them. And what they have in common is that they are all organic compounds, using the word organic in the proper scientific sense, meaning compounds that contain carbon. That's not the usual understanding of organic. You know, people think of organic farming, etc. That's not what we're talking about here. Organic chemically means molecules that have a skeleton of carbon atoms. Minerals do not. Minerals do not contain carbon. But we need both vitamins and minerals in very, very small amounts for optimal health. The one that I think most people have some familiarity with and have questions about is calcium. Now, when we're talking about calcium in the diet, we're not talking about calcium, the metal, which is exactly what it is. Elemental calcium is a bright, lustery, silvery metal. That's not what we're talking about. There are compounds of calcium where calcium is united with some other atom, such as in calcium carbonate, which is just a white powder. So when we talk about our intake of calcium, we're talking about intake of calcium compounds, not metallic calcium. And of course, as soon as we bring up calcium and the body's need for it, we think of bones and the skeleton, because we know that that's where most of the body's calcium is. But in what form? Again, it's not metallic calcium. What we're talking about here is a compound of calcium, which we call calcium hydroxyapatite. I mean, not so important for our purposes, except to realize that it is a combination of calcium with other elements. Anyway, eventually, of course, the calcium does end up in our bones, but it's a long and arduous journey, because for calcium to be absorbed from the intestine into the bloodstream, from where it can travel to the bones and all the other functions it has to perform that we'll see in a minute, it needs some help. And the help that it needs is vitamin D. Without vitamin D in the bloodstream, calcium cannot be properly absorbed from the intestine. Now, vitamin D, of course, is referred to as the sunshine vitamin, which is somewhat of a misnomer because, of course, sunshine doesn't contain the vitamin. When we say that it is the sunshine vitamin, it is because sunshine will form it from a pre-existing compound. And that compound is 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is found in our body. And upon exposure to sunlight, it gets eventually converted to vitamin D, which is needed for the calcium absorption. Calcium gets deposited in the bone, so it forms the skeleton. But the skeleton also is a repository for calcium, so that if the bloodstream needs more calcium, because as you'll see in a moment, calcium is needed for many other functions. It's needed for proper functioning of the heart, the nervous system, etc. If there isn't enough calcium coming in, bones will donate the calcium to the bloodstream. And that is because the bone is actually composed of two different kinds of cells. And these are the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts. And one of them builds bone and the other one dissolves bone. You can remember what these are because osteoclast, think of the C as chipping away. It chips away at the bone. Osteoblast, the B means builds bone. So there's a constant, what we call remodeling of the skeleton. The skeleton is always being formed, more is being added to it, and it is always being lost as some calcium goes into the bloodstream. Now, when these two activities, the osteoblast and the osteoclast activity, are in equilibrium, then we have proper bone formation. That's when we have healthy bone. When the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts work together, some is building bone, some is dissolving bone. It's a dynamic process, but the amount of calcium in the bone stays constant. However, as we get older, what happens is that the osteoclasts and the osteoblasts are not in exact equilibrium. And there's more bone being dissolved in the bloodstream than is being formed. And then, of course, that obviously has an effect on the structure of the bone and on the structure of the body. This is why, as people age, there tends to be a change in the spine as weight pushes down on it, because it is no longer as strong, because the bones are not as well formed. This is natural. I mean, this happens to everyone, but it happens more quickly if there is not enough calcium that is coming into the body, and that the bone has to keep supplying the calcium that is needed for the body systems. When you have that happening, the bones become weak, and that's when we have a condition known as osteoporosis, which is a pretty serious disease. And it's not a rare disease. It strikes women more than men because as women reach menopause, the amount of estrogen their body produces decreases, and estrogen has a function in controlling osteoblast and osteoclast activity. So obviously, you do not want to have osteoporosis. So what can you do in order to try to prevent this? There's been a great deal of research on activity, on physical activity, and what that can do in terms of reducing the risks of osteoporosis. And this is pretty well studied, it's well established. Cardiovascular activity early on in life builds strong bones. But cardiovascular activity is not enough. You also need what we call weight-bearing activity. And this is something that can be pursued at any age. I mean, you don't have to be a professional weightlifter, but you do have to be able to put some weight on your body, some exercise, and this keeps osteoporosis at bay. So this is one of the best things, if not the best thing, that can be done to reduce the risk of osteoporosis. But of course, it has to be started early on in life. Once osteoporosis is diagnosed, then there are medications that can enter into play. And I suspect some of you are familiar with this. The most popular one is Fosamax. Alendronate is the chemical name. And it belongs into a class of drugs called the bisphosphonates. And as you can see, what they do is they reduce the ability of the bones to break down. And it's a very effective drug. It will increase the mass of the bone. Whether or not it decreases fractures is not so clear-cut. After all, I mean, that is the end point that we're looking for, right? Do you reduce the risk of fractures? There's plenty of evidence to show that bones become bulkier, more dense with Fosamax. But the studies don't clearly show that that leads to a reduction in fractures, interestingly enough. There's also, there are problems, of course. Every drug, as you know, has side effects. And one of the risks with all the bisphosphonates is osteonecrosis of the jaw. And this is something that gets played up a lot in the press whenever they talk about Fosamax. The fact, though, is that the incidence of this disease is very, very low. And of course, we're always evaluating risk versus benefit, right? So the benefits of bone building outweigh the risks of necrosis of the jaw. There's also a very, very small risk, and this is really unusual and difficult to explain. People who take the bisphosphonates have a slightly increased risk of fracture of the femur. And no one seems to be able to explain that. But again, the risk here is very, very small. So the benefits outweigh the risks, although the benefits are not as clear-cut as is usually portrayed. It's very clear-cut in strengthening the bone, not so clear-cut that eventually results in fewer fractures. Another drug that is quite widely used now, and I suspect some of you have heard of this, is Prolia. And this impairs the formation of the osteoclasts. Those are the cells that chip away at bone. So obviously that will lead to increased bone strength. But as I mentioned, calcium is important for many functions in the body, much, much more than just bone formation. It is critical for the functioning of the heart, for the nervous system, for muscle contraction. It is an important factor in blood clotting. So we must have adequate amounts of calcium in the bloodstream. And indeed, the body will prioritize these uses of calcium so that if you don't have enough coming in from the diet, it will come from the bones. And that's, of course, how osteoporosis is initiated. So, of course, when we talk about calcium coming in, the obvious question that comes up is what sort of numbers are we talking about, right? Numbers are the alphabet of science. So let's look at the numbers. And the calcium requirements have been pretty well identified. And the way that this is done is by measuring calcium intake in the diet and measuring the amount of calcium that shows up in the urine. And you know that when the amount of calcium that comes in is equal to what goes out in the urine, then you have a stable amount of calcium in the body. So using those kind of experiments, we know roughly the amount of calcium that we should be taking in. So the number I think that you want to keep in mind, and it is an easy number to keep in mind, is 1,000 milligrams, which is 1 gram. If you're getting a gram of calcium a day, you're doing fine. Of course, you have to know what that means. How do you get a gram of calcium? So I'll show you a couple of examples here. And you can sort of start adding up in your mind the numbers to see whether or not you approach 1,000 milligrams a day. You can see that if you just eat a serving of low-fat yogurt, you're already at 400. If you add some cottage cheese, you are getting up there. Sardines are rich in calcium. We also have a lot of fortified foods these days. We have orange juice that is fortified with calcium. Soy milk is fortified with calcium. But of course, the main source of calcium in the diet is dairy products. And if you do not consume any dairy products, it is difficult to get up to the 1,000 milligrams a day. Possible, but difficult. And an added problem here is the degree to which the calcium is absorbed. Because when you're talking about the presence of calcium in foods, for example, you take a look at spinach here, 245 milligrams per 1 cup. That does not mean that if you eat that cup of spinach, all of that calcium is going to be absorbed. Because spinach, of course, is a complex plant product and also contains a lot of oxalates. And these are chemicals that bind the calcium. So while the calcium may be there in the spinach, it is not readily available to be absorbed. This is why we have to look at what we call the bioavailability, which is really what determines how much calcium that you are getting. So although spinach, when you do the analysis, does seem to contain a lot of calcium, you need a lot of servings of spinach to equal a serving of dairy, because the calcium is not so well absorbed. So as you can see, there's no question that dairy is the best way to get the calcium, whether it's milk or yogurt or cheese. Aside from the calcium, of course, milk also contains a number of other very important nutrients. But as you probably know, there's a big anti-milk lobby out there today, telling you that milk is fine for baby calves, but it's not something a human should be eating. This is just nonsense. We have a lot of research that is available about milk. Yeah, in some people, of course, it can cause problems. Lactose intolerance is one. 70% of the world's population suffers from lactose intolerance, meaning that they can't digest lactose, which is the sugar in milk. Some people have milk allergies. That happens. But when you hear things like, milk is carcinogenic, etc., this is just utter nonsense. So dairy is a very good source of calcium. And as I said, today we have a lot of fortified products. For example, orange juice, which nobody will be buying anymore because it comes from the States. But anyway, it contains a good dose of calcium, and it's readily available form. Now, what if you happen to be a vegetarian or a vegan and no dairy products, no meat, whatever? It is possible to get enough calcium, but you do have to work at it. Things like tofu are pretty good sources, but you have to be knowledgeable and select the foods properly if you want to have enough calcium if you're a vegetarian. If you think that you're not getting enough, which many people are not, then of course this is where the calcium supplements come in. And that is big business. Supplements, of course, in North America are a multi-billion-dollar business, and calcium is a big part of that. And as you can see, there's a whole range of these. There's calcium carbonate, calcium sulfate, there's a whole range of them. Historically, the first calcium supplement ever taken was probably by Mark Antony, the suitor of Cleopatra. As the legend says, Cleopatra had made a bet with Mark Antony that she could provide him with the most expensive meal that he had ever had in his life. He took the bet because he had eaten pretty well, and he thought that he had eaten some very, very expensive foods. At this point, Cleopatra took off her pearl earring, dropped it in a cup of vinegar, and asked him to drink that. And indeed, of course, she had provided the most expensive meal in history because the pearl dissolved in the vinegar, and he had a calcium supplement, which he probably didn't need. She probably needed it more. So anyway, what happened here was that the pearl, which is made of calcium carbonate, which is an ideal calcium supplement, dissolved in the vinegar and the acetic acid to form absorbable calcium acetate. Now, of course, this is an apocryphal, legendary story, but nevertheless, it has been made use of, interestingly enough, as you can see, by vinegar producers, sort of implying that it was the vinegar that was the important ingredient here, not the pearl. Anyway, there are many, many different kinds of calcium supplements that are available, but they are not equivalent. The reason that they're not equivalent is because, once again, we have to deal with bioavailability. What you have to ask is, what percentage of the calcium that is present in these supplements actually gets absorbed? And we know this, because this is not a difficult experiment, to carry out. And as you can see, the different supplements contain different amounts of calcium. Because when you look at calcium carbonate, that's made of calcium and carbon and oxygen, so only part of the weight is due to calcium. So we can calculate what percentage of each of these. And then we can have a good shot at availability. However, the labeling of these supplements can be very confusing. Look at this one here. It says calcium 1,200 milligrams as calcium carbonate. In fact, on this label, I don't know what that actually means. Do they mean that the calcium itself is 1,200 milligrams, or the 1,200 milligrams refers to the calcium carbonate, of which only 40% is calcium? With this kind of terminology, you can't tell. I suspect with the 1,200 milligrams, they are referring to calcium carbonate, so only 40% of that would be calcium. What we need is proper labeling. So, for example, when you see a bottle and it says calcium carbonate 500 milligrams, you don't know if the 500 milligrams refers to just the calcium or to the whole pill of calcium carbonate. So what we want to see is labeling like that. Calcium 500 milligrams provided in each calcium carbonate, and the pill weighs 1,250. That's clear. There you know how much you're getting 500 milligrams. But very often the labeling is not clear. So when you look at the supplements, make sure that what you're looking at is the amount of calcium that is actually available. As you might suspect, there is always an ugly side also. Anytime that you're talking about putting something into your body, there are always the ifs and buts and the maybes. And with calcium, you can dig up studies like this, which suggest that calcium supplements increase the risk of cardiovascular events, including heart attacks. So these data justify a reassessment of the use of calcium supplements in older people. But we never consider just one study. We look at all of the evidence. So you can always find a study like this. The present study, and this involves a lot of people, as you can see, 55,000 people, did not find an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or of anything. Then you can find a study like this. For older men and women, calcium intakes were associated with decreased risk of fracture, non-fatal CVD, stroke, and all-cause mortality. So you can find the positive or the negative. You want to take a look at the balance. The balance is that the risks of calcium causing cardiovascular problems are pretty small, not insignificant, so that you don't want to overdo it. And more is certainly not better. If you take 2,000 milligrams of calcium instead of 1,000, it doesn't mean that you're getting twice as much benefit. In fact, you're probably getting less benefit because of all the complications. So you want to stick to the recommended amounts of these nutrients. Most people are familiar indeed with calcium, but I think they're less familiar with magnesium. I mean, they may have heard of mag wheels on cars and know that magnesium is a silvery metal, but what role does it play in nutrition? Well, in this case, our story starts a long time ago. We're going back to Epsom in England in the 17th century. And a farmer dug a well for his cows. And the cows did not want to drink from the water. And he was puzzled by this, didn't know what was going on. So he tasted the water himself and found that it was bitter. And then for some reason, he also tried the water on his skin. He had a rash on his skin, and he found that it improved the rash. And furthermore, he found that when he rubbed his body with this water, his muscle aches tended to disappear. And as you may have guessed already, what he discovered, of course, was Epsom salt. So-called because the discovery was made in Epsom, which of course is a town in England. If you ever go there for a visit, you can visit the original well, or so they say. At least this is the location where supposedly the first farmer had dug the well that the cows did not like. Where did the magnesium in the water come from? It leached out from the soil because magnesium minerals, mostly in the form of dolomite, occur in the soil. The crust of the earth is roughly 2% made of magnesium compounds. So it does dissolve in the water. Any time that you drink water, you will get some magnesium. You'll also get some calcium. These naturally occur in water. And magnesium in sufficient amounts can make the water bitter. If any of you are familiar with the biblical story of Moses and the pond of Marah, when they were wandering through the desert for 40 years, which of course is historical nonsense, but one day they came upon a pond in the desert. And of course they were thirsty and drank from the water, and the water was bitter and alkaline. Magnesium compounds, when they dissolve in the water, makes the water alkaline. What to do? So Moses went to his research director and said, God, what do we do? And God told them to take the wood lying beside the pond and throw it into the water. And indeed, that made the water sweet. Because it turns out that when wood lies out in the sun for a long time, some of the compounds in the wood, like cellulose, get oxidized and it forms acids. So Moses threw the acidic wood into the alkaline water, performed history's first recorded titration, and neutralized the alkalinity, and the water became safe to drink. Anyway, some people will still contend that if you take Epsom salt and put it into water, it relieves stress and soothes aching muscles. There is no real good evidence for that. It does give the water kind of a slimy feel. I guess some people will like that. You can also get a balm, which is made of magnesium, or at least magnesium compounds. And you rub this on, as you can see, a soothing balm packed with magnesium to help with aching muscles and restless legs. A lot of people use this, but I can't really find any clinical trials that show this. Restless legs, very difficult to study because you can't provoke them spontaneously. So it's hard to study. And generally, if you just massage it when you get the cramp, the massage will help. And whether or not you're massaging with the magnesium balm or with nothing, it's hard to know. It makes a difference. Anyway, one thing we do know for sure about magnesium compounds is that they are laxatives, and they are very effective laxatives. I mean, Epsom salt itself is a laxative, but just about any compound of magnesium, including magnesium hydroxide, which you're familiar with as milk of magnesia, is a laxative. Now, laxatives are one class of drugs that really do deliver the goods, right? I mean, and there's no controversy about this because you know whether or not it worked. For the occasional constipation, there's no problem using any of these. But if constipation is chronic, then that is something that has to be further investigated because that's not a normal situation, and it can have many different causes. So magnesium occurs in nature, as I told you. It's part of the minerals that make up the soil, but it has one function which is more important than any other, without which we could not exist, without which there would be no life, because magnesium is in chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is the molecule that allows plants to use sunlight, the energy of sunlight, in photosynthesis. That is, they will then use that energy and convert carbon dioxide in the air and water that they absorb into glucose. And that is the starting material for just about everything that happens in the body. And we cannot live, of course, without glucose. And that cannot be produced in the absence of chlorophyll in plants. We totally rely on plants for our existence, whether we eat them directly or whether we eat them by eating animals, right? The animal is just a way of getting plants into our body, right? The animal has to be fed plant stuff, and we make use of that. So magnesium is absolutely essential to life in that way, that everything that we eat traces back to photosynthesis, because plants cannot grow without photosynthesis. The amount of magnesium that we have in our body is very little, as you can see. Only about 0.1% of the body is made of magnesium. But that small amount does not mean that it is of little importance. It is of great importance because of all the things for which the body needs magnesium. It is needed as a cofactor in numerous reactions, as I'll mention in a moment. It is needed when the body makes DNA. As you can see, it is needed for numerous processes that together constitute life. Enzymes are protein molecules that act as biological catalysts, and they play a critical role in every reaction that goes on in the body, all of which together constitute life. And magnesium is a cofactor in this. That is, the enzymes, in order to carry out their function, have to work together with magnesium. So we don't need very much of it, but whatever we need is critical, because there are over 300 reactions that go on in the body all the time, which require magnesium. So once again, we get back to where does it come from and how much do we need? Well, obviously it comes from food. Everything of which our body is built comes from the food that we eat. We don't need very much magnesium. It depends on your age, but if you want to keep sort of one number in mind here, just like you're keeping in mind 1,000 milligrams of calcium, the number you want to keep in mind here is 400 milligrams. That's a rough estimate. That's the amount of magnesium that you want to take in every day. And then, of course, you have to ask the question, what does that mean practically? What do you have to eat to get 400 milligrams of calcium? Well, here it gives you some idea, or magnesium. It is found in all kinds of foods, including in meat. But once again, notice that it's not that easy to get up to 400 milligrams. Although, like when you're looking at the serving of meat there, it's a 65 milligrams per 220 gram serving. I mean, most people would eat more than 220 grams of meat. So magnesium is quite widespread, but nevertheless, it's not so easy to get up to the 400 milligrams. However, it's also important to note that just because you may not be getting enough does not mean that you're deficient. And the reason for that is that the body is very efficient at retaining magnesium, not letting it get out in the urine, if there is not enough present in the bloodstream. So the body, of course, has backup systems. And if there's not enough magnesium coming in, it will begin to recycle the magnesium, which normally might be released in the urine. Nevertheless, though, I mean, of course, you want to make sure that you're at least in the right ballpark of magnesium intake. There are some conditions where you want to put more emphasis on magnesium intake. For example, people who have inflammatory bowel disease, things like colitis or Crohn's disease. They will need more magnesium because less of it is absorbed through their diseased intestine. Also, people who are diabetics have less ability to absorb, so they could well use a supplement. And of course, supplements are available. There's no question about that, and they're not very expensive. Once again, there are different forms of magnesium. But once again, when you look on the label, what you want to see is the amount of actual magnesium that is available, not the total weight of the magnesium citrate or magnesium malate. There are some other interesting situations where magnesium may be considered. Migraines, for example. There is a lot of research these days on the role of magnesium in migraines. And there is some evidence that taking supplements of magnesium on a regular basis will reduce migraines in people who have a history of migraines. Interestingly enough, there's even a product that is topical, this magnesium stick. At least they claim that just rubbing it on the forehead will relieve the symptoms. I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I mean, they're very inventive with their advertising, as you can see. It also contains eucalyptus and peppermint, etc., and menthol. Maybe that has something to do with relieving the headaches. I don't know. I'd like to see some clinical trials on this. However, I'd also say that if someone really is haunted by migraines, which traditionally are very difficult to treat, there's no harm in trying rubbing a magnesium stick on your forehead. It's certainly not going to harm anyone. Then there are some studies about sleep. Magnesium is very often promoted for enhanced sleep. The studies are all over the place. They're really not conclusive. But the manufacturers, of course, will sell you magnesium supplements claiming that it improves sleep. And then if you cruise the internet, and especially the social media, you'll see all kinds of ads telling you that magnesium is a magical mineral, that we all need more of it in our life because it prevents every disease that you've ever heard of. And of course, this is mostly nonsense. It was all started with a book by Carolyn Dean. called The Magnesium Miracle. And she has a sort of interesting history. As you can see, magnesium does not do great things for the hair. But anyway, she has come up with her own brand of magnesium supplement, doctor created, doctor supported, doctor recommended. Of course, she didn't create this. She wouldn't have any idea on how to create this. This is all hype. But anyway, I have sort of an interesting history with this woman, which goes back about 30 years. And I remember this very well. I was home one morning, and I get a call from a friend, and he says, "Hey, you have to turn on Dini Petty." I didn't know who Dini Petty was and how I was to turn her on at 10 o'clock in the morning. But then it quickly became evident that she was the hostess of the Dini Petty show. Some of you may remember this. It was on CTV. It was a morning talk show. And there was Dr. Carolyn Dean as a guest with her hair not yet abused with the magnesium. And the first words that I heard coming out of her mouth were, if you can't pronounce the words as a chemical, I don't know how many people want to be eating chemicals. Obviously, this endeared her to me instantly. I wrote a letter to CTV saying, that they were spreading this kind of nonsense. And they then actually asked me to come on the show, which I did many, many years ago. And I explained the nonsense of this, that we don't judge whether or not something is safe or not by the number of syllables in its chemical name. And then later, I had an active correspondence with Dr. Dean, who also turned out to be a believer in homeopathy, which is the ultimate absurdity. And so I, attacked her on many grounds. And then I found out she moved to the US, to Hawaii. I wish I could take credit for that, but I can't. But I was satisfied to find out that in 1995, she had her license removed to practice medicine in Canada because of all the crimes that she had committed against patients, improper prescribing, etc. You can see crazy methods of an analysis. But she's still active. She's in Hawaii and spreading her brand of nonsense. She's still promoting magnesium. She's still promoting homeopathy. So she's there making a lot of money. And I'm here talking to you for $10,000. She gets much more. All right. The last one I want to bring up is iron, because a lot of questions come up about that. The first thing to understand is when we talk about iron, again, we don't talk about iron as the metal, except in one case, which we'll talk about. Iron occurs in many forms. It occurs in its elemental form. That's what your cast iron pot is made of. Then it can occur as the double plus ion, which is ferrous iron or ferric ion. And that difference is significant in terms of absorption. Ferrous iron is the iron that is most easily absorbed from food. Ferric iron is less easily absorbed. Of course, as soon as we start talking about iron, no question that the first character who comes up to mind is Popeye. And if you remember the classic song, I'm strong to the finish because I eats my spinach, I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. And spinach contains iron. If you are iron deficient, you become weak. And this is where this whole Popeye story comes from. Because spinach contains iron, and iron deficiency causes weakness, therefore, eating iron makes you strong. And Popeye, of course, is always associated with eating spinach. The fact is that the iron in spinach is ferric iron, which is very poorly absorbed. If you want strong absorption of iron, it's meat, the so-called heme iron. That's ferrous iron, and in meat is present in hemoglobin, which of course is present in our body as well. Hemoglobin is the molecule that binds oxygen, and specifically the iron. Iron is embedded in hemoglobin, and it is to that that oxygen binds. So you have to have hemoglobin to transport oxygen around the system, and every cell in our body needs oxygen in order to perform. So if you don't have enough oxygen being delivered, you are anemic, you lack energy. But just like with calcium and magnesium, iron has other functions as well. It is important in the formation of red blood cells. It's important in myoglobin, which is an iron storage protein in muscles. So as you can see, iron serves numerous purposes. When you have a blood test, what they actually test for is a protein called ferritin. This is the way that iron is stored in the body. And it is from here that it is released whenever the body needs it. So whenever there's iron needed to make more hemoglobin or to make more red blood cells, ferritin will deliver it. So it's the best way, by doing a ferritin test, the best way to know what your iron stores are. If you're iron deficient, this is iron deficiency anemia, and it has a number of symptoms, including fast heartbeat, but of course the one that people are most familiar with is the extreme weakness and the fatigue and shortness of breath. But of course, there are many medical conditions that have similar symptoms. So the only way to know if this is due to iron deficiency is to have a blood test. Now, why would someone be iron deficient? Blood loss is one classic example. If you've been bleeding, even if you bleed slowly, such as rectal bleeding that you might not even notice, but over a period of time, you lose a lot of blood. So just, lack of iron in the diet. Pregnant women require more iron. The fact that iron is necessary has long been known. We go back to mythology in ancient Greece, the story of Jason and the Argonauts. To boost their energy, as the story goes, they consumed shavings from their iron swords. Obviously, having no knowledge of why that would work, well, of course, it's a mythical story, but whoever wrote the myth was familiar with the idea of iron absorption. And then, in the 18th century, doctors regularly recommended eating apples which had been punctured by iron nails. Of course, they recommended the nails be taken out before you eat the iron. But what happens here is that the iron dissolves in the apple because of the acid, malic acid in the apple, and the apple becomes fortified, so it wasn't nonsense. All right, once again, we have to look at numbers, just like we did with calcium and magnesium. And this time, what you want to keep in mind is about 10. 10 milligrams, that's a very small amount. I mean, that would be hardly visible to the eye. But that's what you need regularly in order to maintain your supplies. And it's not that hard to get, as you can see. It is found in all kinds of foods, but there's no question that meat is the best source of iron. But it is found in vegetable products as well. There's a myth, however, about one particular vegetable, and that is spinach. It does contain a lot of iron, but it also is very high in oxalates, as I told you, which impairs iron absorption very significantly. So whereas you can see a serving of meat and a serving of spinach contain the same amount of iron when you test it in the lab, the fact is that when you test it in the blood, the result is not the same. You get much more iron absorbed from the meat. You can always increase iron absorption, even from foods like spinach, by taking it together with vitamin C. Vitamin C takes the iron away from oxalate and allows it to be absorbed. Of course, there are iron supplements available, which only should be taken on the advice of a doctor after having done a test, because you certainly don't want to overdo the iron. I don't think there's a big problem with taking the 28 milligrams. The large 150 milligrams, that's a large dose. That should only be taken when it has been properly diagnosed that you are short of iron. Now, when we take a look at the label of the supplement that we just looked at, you can see that it contains the 28 milligrams, but it also contains vitamin C. And the reason for the vitamin C is to enhance the absorption. So that would be a very good iron supplement, given that you've been diagnosed. These days, it's relatively rare to have iron deficiency because of lack of iron in the diet, because iron is used to fortify many foods. Iron is added to flour, and flour, of course, is used to make pasta, used to make bread, etc. So that's a very significant source of iron. It is also added to cereals. For example, Cheerios will have iron. Now, interestingly enough, believe it or not, here it is in the form of metallic iron, which you can prove. You can take your Cheerios, mash it up, take a magnet, and you will see little particles of iron. Now, in this case, you can use metallic iron because when it gets into the stomach, it reacts with the hydrochloric acid in your stomach and it becomes soluble. So it does make sense. Now, one reason that there probably is more worry about being iron deficient today than there used to be is because we are cooking less in cast iron utensils. We have switched to stainless steel and aluminum. When you cook in cast iron, you're leaching iron out of there, and that's a significant source of iron. Finally, there is also an issue with iron, which is an iron overload disease known as hemochromatosis. Now, this is mostly a genetic condition, so it's not something that most people have to worry about. But in this condition, the body retains too much iron, and it builds up in the liver. And this affects the functioning of the liver in many ways. It reduces the enzymes that the liver produces, and it can also cause cirrhosis of the liver, which comes, as you see, with fatigue and weight loss and lack of energy, etc. And when someone is diagnosed of hemochromatosis, first, it's not a pleasant diagnosis because they have to put in a needle to biopsy the liver. Anyway, you obviously then reduce your intake of iron-rich foods. And in this case, you want to minimize vitamin C because that enhances the intake of iron, no alcohol, and etc. But there is a classic therapy for hemochromatosis. Anyone know what that is? Bloodletting, right? Because when you remove someone's blood, you're removing the iron as well. But again, this, of course, is just upon diagnosis of hemochromatosis. Finally, the idea of increasing iron intake to gain energy. This is a total myth, except if you have iron deficiency anemia. If you have iron deficiency anemia, which of course comes with weakness, you can get energy by taking iron. But if you have normal iron stores, it doesn't do you any good to take extra iron, which of course takes us back to Popeye and the story that Popeye, in order to gain strength, ate spinach. So that wouldn't make sense, right? Unless he was very iron deficient. But even then, spinach would not be good because spinach is not a good source of iron. So that story is a myth. But it's an even bigger myth than people think. You know why? Because never in any of the cartoons did Popeye ever refer to eating spinach because of iron. Popeye said that he was getting strength from spinach because it contains vitamin A. That was his rationale. Never was iron mentioned whatsoever. How that got into folklore is difficult to explain. Now, what about the vitamin A? That's also wrong. First of all, spinach does not contain vitamin A. It contains beta carotene, which in the body can be converted into vitamin A, but vitamin A is found only in animal products, and vitamin A has nothing to do with energy. So the Popeye story is wrong scientifically on many, many different levels. And the story of his eating spinach for strength is a total myth. All right, now finally, because we did look at numbers and how much we need on a regular basis. The fact is that when you look at the commercial multivitamin, multimineral supplements, the amounts that you get in there are sort of enough to fill in gaps if you're not getting enough. And, there's a saying, very common, that if you're taking these supplements and you have a normal diet, basically all you're doing is making your pee more expensive. And, I used to say that too, until I really started looking at diet and taking a look at how much calcium and magnesium there is in the foods. And I noticed that even when you think that you have a pretty good diet, it's hard to get the recommended amounts. So I think one can argue that taking one of these is sort of good nutritional insurance. It doesn't do you any harm, and it might do some good. Which one, it doesn't much matter because they're roughly all the same. And I think in this case, you can rely on the label. As you know, in many cases with dietary supplements, you can't. You don't know what's in it. You buy something like ginkgo biloba, or ashwagandha. You don't really know what is inside based on the label. Sometimes it has more, sometimes less. But here, that's not the case. These are monitored, and indeed, there's no reason for them to lie and cheat, because these vitamins and minerals are not difficult to produce. So in this case, you are most likely to be getting what it says on there. And it's probably not a bad investment, because I think, if you look at your diet and write down scrupulously what you eat during a day, which is actually not easy to do, because people have very difficult time approximating amounts. When you're told that there's so much magnesium per 100 grams of some food, you have to know what 100 grams looks like. Yeah? So it takes some work to work it out. But when you try to do that, I think you find that it's possible that some of these minerals you're not getting enough of. All right, so that's our story for today. Is there anything more that you want to know? Of course, now you want to look for the vitamin supplements that are made in Canada. Don't buy any of the dirty American stuff. Yeah. Well, the story is because liver is the organ that contains the most iron. So once again, that will be true if you're iron deficient. If you're not iron deficient, there's no point in eating liver. As a general rule, I don't think liver should be a regular part of the diet, because liver is the organ in the animal, as it is in the human body, which is a detoxicating organ. This is the organ that tries to remove offensive substances from the bloodstream. So you don't want to be eating that. Yeah. Right. No, once you're taking calcium and vitamin D, you don't need the multi. I mean, you're getting enough calcium there. I mean, hoping that you get all the other stuff too in your diet. Yes. Sorry? We will eventually. We will. I mean, I try to vary what you hear. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, actually in Canada, vitamins are regulated as drugs, so they are tested. So when you are getting when it says 800 IU of vitamin D, that's what it is. Yes. Yeah. The vitamin mineral labels you can believe. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that if you have chronic fatigue, one of the first things that has to be tested is your ferritin levels, which is yeah. But of course, fatigue is linked to many, many other conditions. So you can't assume that fatigue is due to iron deficiency. I mean, that has to be tested because there are numerous conditions that can give you that. Any more? No, geritol is still around. Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, you should never take an iron supplement that is not prescribed. Iron has to be prescribed based on a test. And in terms of doing a bone density test, again, that is something that has to be ordered by a physician based on blood tests, they'll measure calcium levels in the blood. They'll measure vitamin D levels in the blood. If generally, if you are of average or greater than average weight, chances are you don't need. But the only way to know is to test for calcium. Yeah. Sorry? You never heard of vitamin K? I don't think that there's evidence for that. I don't think so. Taking vitamin K, you also have to be careful. And if you are on any kind of anticoagulant medication, Coumadin or heparin, then of course vitamin K is contraindicated. But if vitamin K, of course, has an effect on blood clotting. That's why you would be taking it. But you have to be sure that it's not going to cross-react with something else that you're taking. Yeah. Really? I don't know. Yesterday I bought blueberries at IGA, 244 for the large box, the giant ones they taste delicious. Uh, probably. Probably, but I don't know. I haven't encountered unripe berries, except maybe strawberries, but not blueberries or raspberries. Yeah. You. Fruit? No. The only thing that eating too much fruit can do, as long as you don't have diabetes, yeah. The only thing that eating too much fruit can do is act as a laxative, which is not necessarily bad. So no, I don't think you can overdose on fruit. Yeah. Generally, you see zinc deficiency in people who are vegetarians or vegans, and who have a very high intake of unrefined grains, of whole grains. The whole grains contain a compound called phytic acid, which binds zinc. It's very rare in North America to see a zinc deficiency. I mean, you see, the thing is that even if you have a vegan diet, you're still eating lots of vegetables that contain zinc. And unless you are also eating a lot of unrefined grains, whole grains, which I guess, some vegans do, it's not likely. It's not likely. But, if you don't eat meat and you're eating a lot of whole grains, it's possible. Yeah. Is what? Blackberry? It is. Blackberries are very rich in polyphenols. Those are the compounds that supposedly are, the healthy things in berries. Yeah. No, they're good. I like blackberries. Yeah. All right, we'll see you next month.